Hi there. Today we're going to look into a very important part of North African culture and traditions which relate to the religion of Islam. Now, as we talked about in the last lectures about Egypt, we know that the fall of Greece and Rome was brought on by the expansion of the Middle Eastern empires and eventually the conquering of the growth of Islam throughout the Middle East and North Africa. So we need to talk about how this impacts the culture and society. And to begin with, I want to just sort of talk about Islam generally and some of the key philosophical ideas and religious tenets that define Islam today. To begin with, the word Islam means specifically surrender. And in fact, it means surrender to the will of Allah. And as a word naming this religion, it already sort of indicates a kind of willingness to acknowledge this all-powerful, unique deity, Allah, God, which is at the center of Islamic faith. At the same time, it's important to note that the word Islam is not as central a tenet or an idea as other concepts in the religion of Islam, and that the name Islam is only a kind of more recent name given to the religion that for centuries went by many other names and has been sort of more commonly understood as kind of among the faithful, the Imam. And so this community of the faithful is a much more common idea in the teachings of Islam. But this is the term that has been accepted and acknowledged by both Muslims and the outside world. And it, of course, for people who might feel uncomfortable with this idea of surrendering your personal free will, it's important to understand that this idea of surrender is to surrender to those things which you have no control over. It doesn't mean complete and absolute surrender to every aspect of your life. In fact, there's a very famous saying by Yahya ibn Ziyad, foolish is the person who misses his chance and afterwards reproaches fate. So this saying from the 10th century is written on the perimeter of this plate. It is the plate would have been something that would have been served with full of food, and as people were dining, the message would slowly be kind of revealed and become a topic of conversation for those who were around the table. And so this message is one that recognizes this idea that we have choice, we have agency in our lives, and that to cast our failings to our missed opportunities to fate is something that is ultimately very foolish to Muslims, and that we have to recognize those things that we can act on, and at the same time recognize those things we cannot. So getting back to Islam, how does this idea play out here? The word of Islam, the teachings of Islam are contained within a holy book known as the Quran, that is specifically the word of God. That is, are these words that came through Muhammad, and we'll talk more about him in a minute, through Muhammad, and were recorded by his followers, and then compiled, and these are the teachings of God as spoken through Muhammad. They're not everything Muhammad said or did in his lifetime. Those are been recorded elsewhere. But here, these are only those prophetic sayings that Muhammad spoke as in the word of God came through him. And Muslims who are the followers of Islam, and they are the ones who have this community. And this is a very important idea in Islamic faith. And a lot of what it means to be Muslim, is to belong to this community and to participate in the practices of supporting other members of this community. So Islam is very closely related to the geography of the Middle East. It's where it originated and very quickly spread throughout. And its cultural tenets of Islam and the culture of the Middle East at this time are deeply ingrained with each other. That said, it's good to remember always that the most populous Muslim cultures in the world are not in the Middle East. The most populous country that is Muslim is actually Indonesia in Southeast Asia. And the second is Pakistan and Bangladesh. So there's a lot of people outside of Islam that have adopted this religion, that have brought new cultural identity and new cultural concepts to this religion. But for now, let's talk about the important cities where it all began, Medina and Mecca. And it is here where Muhammad lived and in his activities really defined. The sort of dark green area is the spread of Islam within the lifetime of Muhammad. You can see even within his lifetime, he already had quite a few followers in quite a fairly large geographic area, that his personal agency and his personal actions and his way of communicating his religion to his followers was sort of instrumental in creating this extraordinary religious following. So what do we know about Muhammad? What do we know about Muhammad in his life? We know he was a merchant, that he was not of a high status person. He was fatherless at birth, that much of his status, what people recognized him as a man of status, really came from his wife. He married a wealthy widow named Khadija, who belonged to a very prestigious family. And it was really her who, after his vision, would encourage him to become this prophet, and that the words were coming through him, and he was terrified of this role that he felt thrust upon. And so it was part of this sort of transformation that came really fairly late in his life. He had been a spiritual person, but fairly private, and he had been practicing this faith of the Hani, and who were the people who were monotheistic, but not necessarily Christian or Jewish. They had a kind of unique take, and it was from this community that he comes up to define his own specific brand of monotheism. So at age 40, which at this time is considered very old, he is on a retreat where he meets a person who he later identified as the angel Gabriel, who forces him to repeat these words: recite in the name of God, the merciful and the compassionate, recite, and your Lord is most generous. He teaches by the pen. He teaches man what he knew not. Now, of course, this was what Muhammad spoke in Arabic, and the language of Arabic is key to understanding this was how God spoke to Muhammad. And now, how are we supposed to understand this? Well, this is prophetic speech. So the kind of language this embodies is a kind of visionary speech. It is meaningful on many, many levels, and it resonates on many, many levels. And many would say this is the finest and most beautiful poetry ever written in Arabic. And so when we look at the Quran, which is this compilation of these prophetic sayings, it's not organized in a narrative way like the Bible is in many places. It doesn't have a clear beginning, middle, and end. It's actually sort of organized by the length of the prophetic speech. So starting at the beginning and reading through, one can very quickly become sort of disoriented and confused by what one is reading, because it doesn't sort of cohere. It requires a great deal of commentary and insight to be able to kind of piece together the meaning of Islam from the Quran itself. And we have a lot of different understandings and meanings with these things. We look at Islam, we notice that Islam is not a monolithic, singular entity, but in fact is made up of many, many different kinds of Islamic practices. The most common division in Islam is between the Sunni and the Shia. And this is a division that began going way back to the very early years of Islam. After the death of Muhammad, there was no immediate heir apparent because Muhammad did not have any male heirs, and he did not indicate anyone who should be the person to lead after him. And this happens in the year 632 AD. And at this time, there was a kind of split. There was a split between the people who believed that it should be members of Muhammad's family, his brothers and his brothers-in-law, people who had married his daughters, and that his in-laws would then inherit this status. And many people didn't believe this was appropriate, so they believed it should be a part of the caliphate as an organization of leading people. So there was a struggle between the Sunnis, who believed it should be in the caliphate, and the Shia, who believed it should be a part of the Muhammad's family. And the Shia were roundly defeated, and they were eventually, Ali was chosen as one of the fourth caliphate, but a violent conflict broke out. Two of the earliest caliphates were murdered. A war erupted, and he too was killed in the fighting in the year 661 AD or CE, near the town of Kufa, which is now in present-day Iraq. And so these divisions, these wars, at times these divisions are seen incidental, but at times they've risen to become, these unbearable animosities that have flared as other kinds of economic and political instability have racked the region. And so that's where we are today. And you will often hear about Sunni or Shia attacks on one or the other. And this is one of the sort of unfortunate legacies of the early years of Islam. There are other types of Islam besides Sunni and Shia. They are difficult to know. They are a small minority of Islamic practices, but they are kind of diffused and dispersed throughout Sufi, which tends to be a part of Islam which believes in a kind of individual prophetic actions and speech. And this tradition of mystical Islam has a long history. The word Sufi basically means a kind of sackcloth, a kind of poor behavior that people would adopt in order to sort of become kind of wandering mystics. And they were people who believed that they, like Muhammad, had this way of coming close to God, and that to act like that and have that in their lives, the ability to feel free to interpret the Quran and to freely access their own conversations with God. This, of course, can be to many outside Muslims kind of heretical idea that you could sort of freely choose or pick however you want to live. The most famous of the Sufi poets and mystics was Jalal al-Din Muhammad Rumi, or sometimes just known as Rumi, who was a Persian poet of extraordinary writing skill, and you could certainly enjoy his poems today in translation, many, many different translations of his work. Salafi, or Wahhabism, is a more contemporary development. It's a fairly extreme, anti-colonial, Western tradition that grew up in the 18th century by Muhammad ibn Abdul al-Wahhab, who strongly opposed the occupation of the Middle East by these Europeans and later Americans. And this was a part of this legacy, this sort of radical, literal interpretation of Islam, which promoted this idea that by whatever means it was necessary to free their lands from the occupation of Westerners. And so this was a very radical take that has had its proponents and is, of course, now wedded into the traditions of Saudi Arabia. And this is where we see the kind of extremism that comes from this and many of the other sort of extreme schools of thought that have flourished in Islam in recent years. Those that have, gone on to become terrorist organizations always have their allegiance to Wahhabism. Now, again, this is a minority of Muslims, and it is, and ideas contained within it are very radical and position an idea of antagonism, which many Muslims reject. Regardless of what your kind of Islam is, whether you are Sufi, Sunni, Salafi, or Shia, or Sunni, there are 5 pillars of Islam which all Muslims belong to and subscribe to. So these are sort of the basic tenets. And I think they're important to note because they sort of kind of define the core values and ideas that everyone sort of recognizes. And moreover, the reason why it's good to know these things is that they tell us a lot of things of what's not there. The kinds of things that we think are sort of essential to being Muslim are not, and have, accordingly, a fairly broad range of interpretation. So let's talk about the 5 pillars of Islam. The first is to recite the profession of faith, the Shahada in Arabic. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And that is essentially the core faith of Muslims. There is this idea of a monotheistic deity, Allah, and that he spoke to Muhammad. And that is the core faith in Islam. And then following that, the next pillar of Islam is this idea of 5 daily prayers. Now, according to where you are, what city, these change. And I've known Muslims who follow this and many who choose to pray at different times according to what it is. It's not an absolute thing. It's, again, according to their needs of the day and the time. And it varies, again, from city to city exactly when these occur. But generally there is one right at sunrise, one at midday. There's one just in late afternoon, one right at sunset, and then one right before you go to bed. Now that may seem like a lot, but it's actually, they're only about 5, maybe 10 minutes in length. And the people who practice it, go about their daily business with very little interruption. Sometimes on Friday at noon, there might be a slightly longer service, and that would be followed by some words by the local imam, the person who is sort of taking care of the mosque. But there is very little that's supposed to come between you and God. You're to orient yourself toward Mecca, and we'll talk more about that later. But there is this sense that you're not supposed to worship anything, any place. You're supposed to directly address and send your prayers to God. Next, there is the zakat, which is a tax to support the mosque and the local community and the poor. And this is according to what you can pay, and it's a part of all these religions, Jewish faith and Christianity, all this idea of giving alms and supporting the community. Fourth, there is the fasting month of Ramadan, and this is when the community will not have any water or any food during daylight hours for this whole month. And this, because the Muslim calendar, the months are lunar months, this sort of shifts back in time by about 10 days each year. So it can come at a time which, people might have to go out, work, and harvest in the fields. And it can be very difficult. And they try and look out for each other. They like to, the point of the fast is to build the community, not to punish people. And if, of course, you're pregnant or you are old or very young, no one would expect you to endure this hardship. But many people undertake this willingly, and as a sense of a kind of a way to bring the community together and feel closer to God. Lastly, this most dramatic of pillars of Islam is if you're financially able to do this, you are to make a pilgrimage to Mecca and circumambulate this shrine known as the Kaaba and undertake the Hajj. Now, the Hajj is actually fairly long and complicated series of activities that people engage in, and there's a sort of training that's necessary, and it costs a lot of money, and many people spend a good portion of their life sort of saving up to do this. And as the world gets wealthier and as the Muslims in general have become more wealthy, you can see here that millions upon millions of people come to Mecca during the month of Ramadan. And it's now become this enormous task to help mitigate this incredible crush of people trying all to do this pilgrimage. So those are the 5 pillars of Islam. And for this class, one idea, which is not a pillar of Islam, that's very important to our discussion about art, is the idea of iconoclasm. It comes up a lot because of its impact on the visual art that is possible within, or believed to be possible. There's very little that directly addresses this idea of iconoclasm, which literally means the destruction or the casting out of pictures, icons, namely religious icons, that there's a kind of prohibition, and not just a kind of not showing something, but really a kind of destruction of images. And there is a sentiment that is sort of veiled in not specific. Believers, wine, arrow shuffling, idols, and divining arrows are an abomination, some of Satan's work. Then avoid it. In this passage from the Quran, we can see that drinking, gambling, fortune-telling, and sort of like voodoo dolls are an abomination. And these are things that these idols and black magic and all these things would have seen as something destructive to the community. And so it was very important to kind of ban these to make sure that they had a stable, healthy community. So in this context, we can see that the word idols here, though it doesn't specifically identify, the kind of black magic figures that would have been what specifically seems to be addressing, it can be broadly interpreted to mean any kind of work of art. And that's ambiguity has been sort of explored in other areas of Islamic tradition. So outside the Quran, as I say, we know about what Muhammad said and did during his lifetime by a fairly large collection of received information from people who were his followers, and people would record the things that Muhammad said and did, and they compiled these for years. And for many years, even after the death of Muhammad, people continued to add to the Hadith. So the Hadith is got a very large body of textual information about Muhammad and his feelings and beliefs and ideas about what it means to be a Muslim. And it's from here that people try to look to understand and make interpretations of how to best live their own lives. So one of the most striking things we know about Muhammad is that when he and his followers eventually overthrew the city of Mecca, they came to this shrine in the center of town, the Kaaba, which had been a pagan shrine. It had been a well that had been dug by Abraham, and there have been many other deities that were honored there. And finally, he just said, enough, when no other deity will be worshipped here. This is only for the worship of Allah. Okay, so we know that he had destroyed all these other pagan deities in this one location. Okay, and it was specifically to say that this is the place that is exclusively for the worship of Allah. Okay, so this is a very interesting choice. There are some passages in the Hadith that said that he actually spared a shrine that was in honor of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. Okay, so this is the problem with the Hadith. There are contradictory pieces of information. Some would say, well, that's probably not true. That was added later. Whatever the reason is, the Hadith is understood to be a kind of text which demands interpretation and selection, and it's not something that is absolutely understood the same by all people. There are other statements. It is believed that Muhammad said an angel will not enter a house that has a dog or a painting in it. And here, a painting was considered to be a kind of vain or ostentatious display of wealth, and you were supposed to adopt a more humble attitude and not produce and decorate your house with artwork. Here's a very important philosophical idea that God is the great shaper of living things, that God is this creator, and that artists should not imitate God's unique power. And because creation is God's power, artists should not attempt to imitate or act like God. In the same way that it's inappropriate for people to torture or to maim, because they say only God punishes by fire. And so this ways in which they sort of cordon off areas that are the unique aspects of God that man should not imitate. Okay, so this is a part of the devotion. And this is an area where you'll see an awful lot of, well, how much does something have to look like a something for it to be imitative of God's unique power? And there's also this long-standing idea that those who create art are, in fact, transgressing this idea, and that they will be punished on Judgment Day by sort of being asked to make alive those things that they have created, and sort of failing to do that, be punished for their hubris in creating things that have no soul. Now, a lot of people have commented on this idea. I think one that's particularly interesting is the Kenyan Muslim, Ali Mazrui, who is also a writer and social commentator and author. And he writes about his Muslim upbringing in Kenya. And he says, I could draw the mango, but not the mango tree. I could draw a shoe, but not the shoemaker. Making anything that was alive was an attempt to imitate God's unique power. So in his family, this is the way in which he was told he must behave. And this is how it may have, made him adverse to becoming an artist in many ways. But it also sort of deepened his respect for those things that God creates. Needless to say, even though there is this tradition of iconoclasm in Islamic heritage, there has been a remarkable amount of art in Islamic countries, especially in Persia, where we have these Persian paintings in the Middle East, in the country that is now Iran. We have a long-standing tradition of creating these miniature paintings, okay? So this is from 1488 CE, and this is just the detail of a painting. So what I'm showing you here is actually almost about a couple inches square. It's very tiny. And even there you can see how incredibly detailed this painting is. And that's the nature of Islamic art, is it's trying to create this kind of intimate, jewel-like painting. And you'll notice that it's all very decorative. It's also very flat. And that in the arts of Islam, there's an attempt to try and avoid making things like life. So God's unique creative power would not be imitated. And one of the ways they did that is they drew and painted things without shadows so that it would appear more, like a design, more like a decoration than an actual the illusion of a three-dimensional thing. So if you look at this even closer, you will notice that this has in the face of Yusuf, who is a prophet, his face has been rubbed out. Now the face of his wife Sarah, shown holding on to his arm, has not been rubbed out. And here, this is a very interesting contrast. So at some point after this was painted, many, many years later, I imagine, someone had possession of this picture. And the fact that Yusuf had a face was enough to make them uncomfortable. Maybe the person believed the artist who created was now being punished in hell for their creation. And so, without destroying the actual work, they simply rubbed out the face. So this is how this sort of changing values about what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, how these have impacted art over the centuries. At one point, it was acceptable to paint a face on Yusuf, right, this prophet. And then later, someone would think, no, we can't do that. And so this shift in changing values in iconoclasm has had an extraordinary impact on the long legacy of Islamic art.